When the HOA president tried to evict him, she had no idea she was walking into her own nightmare. Malik Patterson had always dreamed of owning property in a quiet, upscale neighborhood. After years of hard work, he finally made it happen. The house, a stunning two-story brick home in Brentwood Estates, Tennessee, sat on a neatly trimmed lot with a wraparound porch and a spacious backyard. It was exactly what he had envisioned: peaceful, elegant, and the perfect place to settle down. But something felt off from the very first day. Moving boxes still lined the driveway when Malik noticed the eyes, peeking from behind curtains, watching from porches, lingering a second too long as neighbors walked their dogs. No one approached, no friendly introductions, no welcome to the neighborhood, just silence. At first, he brushed it off. Maybe people here just kept to themselves. Maybe they'd warm up over time. The first sign that wouldn't happen came the next morning. Malik had barely finished brewing his coffee when he heard a sharp knock at the door. He opened it to find a woman in her mid-60s standing on his porch. She was dressed in a neatly pressed beige blouse, pearl earrings, and a pin with the HOA emblem clipped onto her cardigan. Her posture was rigid, her expression neutral, but there was something in her eyes, something Malik couldn't quite place. "Good morning," she said, her tone clipped. "I'm Barbara Whitman, president of the Brentwood Estates Homeowners Association." Malik extended a hand, offering a polite smile. "Nice to meet you. I know who you are," she interrupted, barely sparing a glance before looking past him into the house. "I wanted to go over a few things." She handed him a thick stack of printed documents stapled in the corner. HOA guidelines. Malik skimmed the pages, noting the usual rules: lawn maintenance, exterior paint restrictions, approved mailbox designs, standard stuff. Then Barbara cleared her throat. "We like to maintain a certain standard here," she said, her gaze settling on the moving truck still parked in the driveway. "I assume you'll have that removed by this evening?" Malik raised an eyebrow. "It'll be gone once I'm done unpacking." Barbara nodded, but it wasn't a satisfied nod. More like she was making a mental note. "Good," she said. "And just so you're aware, the HOA requires that trash bins be placed at the curb no earlier than 6 a.m. on collection day. I noticed yours were out last night." Malik frowned. "I didn't put them out. The previous owners must have." Barbara pursed her lips. "I see. Well, in the future, please be mindful. We have rules for a reason." And just like that, she turned and walked away. Malik shut the door, exhaling slowly. Maybe she was just particular. A lot of HOA presidents were. He wasn't going to let one uptight neighbor ruin his fresh start, but the next few days made it clear. Barbara wasn't just particular, she was watching. A warning notice appeared in his mailbox about an unauthorized vehicle in the driveway. His own car. A second notice came about improper lawn maintenance. His grass had grown an inch, maybe two. Then an HOA violation letter arrived about a porch light that was too bright, despite being the same fixture the previous owner had used. By the end of the week, Malik had collected a neat stack of papers from Barbara. He hadn't spoken to her since their first meeting, but it didn't matter. She had made herself known. Still, he kept his cool. Maybe she was this way with everyone. Maybe he just needed to follow the rules and she'd back off. But that hope faded fast when Malik took an evening walk and passed by a group of neighbors chatting on a nearby driveway. They grew quiet when they saw him. One woman offered a tight smile, but no one else acknowledged his presence. And there, standing in the middle, was Barbara. Arms crossed, whispering something to the others. Malik didn't need to hear the words to know this wasn't about HOA rules. It was about him. But if Barbara thought she could intimidate him into leaving, she was in for a surprise. The letters kept coming. Each morning, Malik found a new notice folded neatly in his mailbox, sealed with the Brentwood Estates HOA stamp. At first, he tossed them in a kitchen drawer, skimming them just enough to confirm what he already knew. Barbara Whitman was determined to make his life miserable. By the time he received the fifth letter in just 2 weeks, Malik had had enough. This time, it was about his trash cans. Bins must be retrieved within 1 hour of collection to preserve neighborhood aesthetics, the letter read. Malik stared at the paper, irritation bubbling under his skin. He had picked up his bins the same way his neighbors had, after work. But apparently that wasn't good enough. Curious, he decided to do a little test. The next morning, he woke up early and took a slow walk through the neighborhood, paying close attention to the houses. By 9 a.m., dozens of trash bins were still lined up along the curbs. Some weren't even fully closed, lids propped open with overflowing bags. Not a single violation notice on any of them, just his. Malik snapped a few pictures and sent an email to the HOA board, politely asking why his bins were an issue while everyone else's were ignored. No response. But 2 days later, Barbara was back on his doorstep. She didn't knock this time, just stood there waiting. Arms crossed, clipboard in hand, Malik opened the door and leaned against the frame. "Something I can help you with?" Barbara didn't answer right away. She looked over his shoulder, eyes scanning the inside of his home like she was taking inventory. Then she held up a form. "This is a formal request for you to submit proof of home ownership," she said. "We've had complaints." Malik's stomach tightened. "Complaints?" Barbara continued, her voice syrupy but sharp. "Neighbors have expressed concerns. They've noticed unusual activity, different cars coming and going, furniture deliveries at odd hours. Some are worried you may be renting this property in violation of HOA regulations." Malik let out a short, humorless laugh. "You're kidding." Barbara's face didn't flinch. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "First off, I own this house. Second, I've lived here less than a month. I'm still moving in. That's why there have been deliveries. And as for the cars, those are friends and family visiting." Barbara pressed her lips together, her fingers tightening around her clipboard. "Well, we have policies to ensure all homeowners are properly vetted. We'll need to verify your deed." Malik knew exactly what this was. She hadn't asked any other neighbors for proof of home ownership, just him. Still, he kept his voice level. "You can pull the records yourself. It's public information." Barbara's eyes narrowed slightly, but she quickly recovered, smoothing out her expression. "I'd prefer if you submitted it directly." Malik tilted his head. "And if I don't, then I'll have no choice but to escalate the matter with the HOA board." Malik exhaled slowly. She wanted him to react, to get angry, to give her an excuse. So he just smiled. "I'll think about it." Then he closed the door in her face. Malik leaned against the door for a moment, inhaling deeply, his hands curled into fists before he forced them to relax. He wasn't about to let Barbara Whitman get under his skin. He had dealt with difficult people before, and he had no intention of backing down just because someone didn't think he belonged in her pristine little neighborhood. The next morning, Malik decided to take action. He pulled up the HOA bylaws and spent hours combing through them. As he suspected, there was nothing about requiring proof of ownership for an existing resident. Barbara had fabricated the rule to intimidate him. A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. If Barbara wanted a fight, she was going to get one. But he was going to do it the right way, by using the very rules she thought gave her power. That evening, he composed a professional but pointed email to the HOA board, copying Barbara in the message. Subject: Inquiry regarding HOA documentation requests. Dear Brentwood States. HOA board, I recently received a request from President Barbara Whitman demanding that I submit proof of home ownership. Upon reviewing the HOA bylaws, I was unable to find any rule requiring existing homeowners to provide such documentation. I'd like to formally request clarification on this matter. If this is a newly enacted rule, please provide written notice of when it was approved and how it applies to all residents equally. Additionally, I've noticed selective enforcement of various HOA policies. I'd appreciate a response detailing how HOA violations are fairly distributed among residents. I look forward to your prompt response. Best regards, Malik Patterson, homeowner, Brentwood States. The email was a carefully laid trap. If Barbara responded, she'd have to explain why she was targeting him. If she ignored it, it would serve as further proof of discrimination. 2 days later, the response arrived. Subject: Ray, inquiry regarding HOA documentation requests. Dear Mr. Patterson, thank you for reaching out. After reviewing your concerns, we can confirm that the Brentwood Estates HOA does not have a formal requirement for existing homeowners to provide proof of ownership. As such, you are not required to submit any additional documentation. Regarding your concern about policy enforcement, we will conduct an internal review to ensure all regulations are applied fairly across the neighborhood. Thank you for bringing this to our attention. Best, Stephen Kessler, Brentwood Estates HOA board member. Malik read the email twice just to be sure. He could practically hear Barbara grinding her teeth as she realized her authority had been undercut by her own board. The victory was satisfying, but Malik knew Barbara wouldn't let this go, and he was right. The very next day, she struck back. This time, it came in the form of a violation notice taped to his door. Improper lawn maintenance. Malik shook his head, laughing under his breath. He had mowed his lawn just 3 days ago. He took a slow walk through the neighborhood and, as expected, spotted multiple homes with grass taller than his. No notices on their doors. Barbara wasn't even trying to be subtle anymore. Later that afternoon, as Malik was watering his garden, a familiar voice cut through the air. "Afternoon, Malik." He turned to see Lisa Hendricks, one of the few neighbors who hadn't completely ignored him. She offered him a sympathetic smile. I see you got the infamous lawn notice. Malik chuckled. Yeah, I suppose my grass is a national security threat now. Lisa sighed, shaking her head. Barbara's been running this place like her personal kingdom for years. People are afraid to speak up, but everyone knows what she's doing. Malik studied her. And you? She hesitated before sighing. I voted against her re-election last year, but most people either support her or don't want to make. Malik nodded. Well, I don't mind making waves, Lisa grinned. I figured as much. Malik glanced back at his house. Do you know when the next HOA meeting is? Lisa's smile widened. Next week, and I think you should be there. When the day of the meeting arrived, Malik walked into the Brentwood Estates clubhouse to find nearly 30 homeowners seated in rows. At the front, Barbara sat stiffly, a gavel resting in front of her. Lisa had been right. Most of the people in the room seemed indifferent, but there was an unmistakable tension in the air. Barbara's eyes locked onto Malik as he took a seat. Mr. Patterson, she said coolly, what brings you here tonight? Malik folded his hands in his lap. I'm here to address some concerns. Barbara's smile didn't reach her eyes. Well, residents are free to bring up community matters at the end of the agenda. Until then, please remain quiet. Malik didn't respond. He simply leaned back in his chair and waited. The meeting dragged on with mundane discussions about neighborhood watch schedules and landscaping budgets. Finally, Barbara sighed. Are there any community concerns to address? Malik raised his hand. Yes. Barbara barely contained her irritation. Go ahead. Malik stood. I have concerns about selective enforcement of HOA regulations. I've received multiple violations for things that are widely overlooked for other residents. When I asked for proof that these rules were being enforced fairly, I was ignored. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Barbara's face remained neutral. The HOA enforces rules as necessary to maintain community standards. Malik folded his arms. Then why are violations being given disproportionately to certain homeowners? I have photographic evidence that my lawn was in better condition than others who were not cited. Elisa, sitting a few rows back, spoke up. He's right. I've noticed it too. More whispers, a few nods. Barbara tapped her gavel. Order, please. Stephen Kessler, the board member who had responded to Malik's email, cleared his throat. Mr. Patterson, do you have documentation? Malik nodded and handed over printed photos of lawns throughout the neighborhood, each time-stamped. As you can see, my home was singled out. Stephen looked at the images, then at Barbara. These do raise concerns. Barbara's grip on her gavel tightened. We have processes in place. Then why are they being misused? Malik pressed. A heavy silence settled over the room. Stephen glanced at the other board members, then turned back to Barbara. I think we should review these complaints properly. Barbara's face paled. I've always acted in the best interest of this community. Malik raised an eyebrow. If that were true, I wouldn't be standing here. More murmurs. Stephen let out a slow breath. I believe it's time we evaluate leadership within the HOA. Malik gave a slow nod. Good. And while you're at it, I'd like to file a formal complaint against Barbara Whitman for harassment, falsifying HOA complaints, and attempting to misuse her authority for personal grievances. Barbara's jaw clenched, but the room was no longer on her side. Lisa hesitated, then said, I second that. One by one, hands started rising around the room. Barbara's reign was crumbling, and she knew it. Barbara's grip on her gavel tightened, but she could see the shift in the room. The power she had wielded for years was slipping through her fingers, and Malik was standing at the center of it. Stephen Kessler, the board member who had backed Malik's concerns, cleared his throat. We need to take these complaints seriously. We can't allow selective enforcement of HOA regulations. Barbara forced a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. I have always acted in the best interests of Brentwood Estates. These accusations are baseless. Malik met her gaze evenly. Then you won't mind an internal audit of all violation notices given in the past 3 years, will you? The room erupted in whispers. Malik knew this was the breaking point. If Barbara refused, she'd look guilty. If she agreed, the audit would expose her bias. Lisa, who had been watching closely, leaned forward. That sounds reasonable. If everything has been handled fairly, there shouldn't be any issues, right? Barbara's expression tightened. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, she exhaled sharply. Fine, we'll conduct a review. Stephen nodded. Good. And until it's complete, I move to suspend all pending violation notices. A murmur of agreement spread through the room. Barbara looked like she wanted to argue, but she was outnumbered. All in favor? Stephen asked. Hands shot up around the room. Barbara clenched her jaw. Motion passes. Malik hid his satisfaction behind a neutral expression. The battle wasn't over, but this was a major victory. He had forced Barbara's hand, and now the truth would come to light. As the meeting adjourned, neighbors slowly approached Malik. Some offered hesitant smiles, others quiet words of support. Lisa grinned, giving him a nod of approval. "You did good tonight," she said. Malik chuckled. "Let's see what happens next." Over the next few weeks, the HOA board dug into the records. What they found was worse than anyone had expected. Barbara had issued over 200 violation notices in the past 3 years. Nearly 70% of them had been directed at a small handful of homeowners, including Malik, who had only lived in the neighborhood for a month. Patterns emerged. Certain residents, mostly those who were new, minorities, or had openly disagreed with Barbara, had been hit repeatedly with minor violations. Meanwhile, long-term residents who broke the same rules went unnoticed. The final report was damning. When the next HOA meeting was called, the turnout was even bigger than before. Barbara sat at the front, her composure rigid, but there was no mistaking the tension in her posture. She knew what was coming. Stevens stood first, addressing the crowd. "After a thorough review, it is clear that our HOA regulations have been unfairly enforced under President Whitman's leadership. We cannot allow this to continue." Barbara's voice was tight. "This is a witch hunt. I was simply doing my job." Malik raised an eyebrow. "Your job isn't to harass homeowners. The data speaks for itself." Lisa stood up. "I move for a vote of no confidence in Barbara Whitman's presidency." The room broke into murmurs again. The shift was happening faster than Barbara could contain it. Stephen nodded. "Is there a second?" Malik raised his hand. "I second the motion." Barbara's face darkened. "You can't just—" "Yes, we can," Stephen interrupted. "All in favor?" Hands went up. First a few, then half the room, then nearly everyone. Barbara's face turned red. "This is ridiculous. You all think you can just push me out? I have given my life to this community." Malik met her eyes. "And yet the community has spoken," Stephen cleared his throat. "With a majority vote, Barbara Whitman is officially removed as HOA president, effective immediately. The board will appoint an interim leader until the next election." Barbara's hands trembled as she slammed her gavel down one final time. "You'll regret this." Malik smiled. "I doubt it." With that, Barbara stormed out, her reign over Brentwood Estates officially over. After the meeting, Lisa approached Malik. "So what now?" Malik exhaled, glancing around the clubhouse. "Now we rebuild. We make this place what it was supposed to be. Fair." Lisa grinned. "Sounds like you'd make a great HOA president." Malik laughed. "Let's take it one step at a time." But as he looked around at the now hopeful faces of his neighbors, he realized something. He had just changed this community forever. With Barbara gone, the tension that had suffocated Brentwood Estates for years finally began to lift. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak up started coming together, sharing their own stories of unfair treatment under Barbara's rule. The once silent streets were now filled with conversations, laughter, and the unmistakable energy of change. Malik had become an unexpected leader in the community. Though he had no intention of running for HOA president, his name was already circulating among the residents. Every day someone new approached him, thanking him for standing up against Barbara's tyranny. "You really should consider it," Lisa said one afternoon as they stood near Malik's driveway. "People trust you. They need someone who actually cares about fairness." Malik chuckled, shaking his head. "I just wanted to live in peace, Lisa, not run a neighborhood." She smirked. "Well, too late for that." At the next HOA meeting, the board announced that an election for a new president would take place in 2 weeks. In the meantime, an interim leader, Stephen Kessler, would oversee the transition. Barbara, now stripped of her title, was nowhere to be seen. As the election neared, Malik was officially nominated. He hadn't planned on it, but when multiple residents submitted his name, he realized he couldn't walk away from the opportunity to make things right. His opponent was Richard Nolan, one of Barbara's longtime supporters. A rigid man in his late 50s, Richard had served on the board under Barbara's leadership and had every intention of maintaining the status quo. At the community debate, Richard tried to paint Malik as an outsider. "We don't need drastic change. Brentwood Estates has always upheld strong values." Malik raised an eyebrow. "Values like harassment, selective enforcement, neighbors living in fear of violations over trivial matters? If that's what you're defending, then yes, I do stand for change." The audience erupted in applause. Richard pressed his lips together but continued. "Experience matters. I've been involved in HOA affairs for years. And yet, those years led us to the mess we're cleaning up now," Malik countered. "Maybe it's time for fresh leadership." By the end of the debate, it was clear where the community stood. On election day, the votes were counted and the results were undeniable. Malik Patterson was officially elected as the new HOA president of Brentwood Estates. Lisa beamed as the results were announced. Told you! Malik laughed. Yeah, you did. With new leadership in place, real reforms began. The HOA policies were reviewed and rewritten to ensure fairness. The ridiculous fines and excessive micromanagement were stripped away. Transparency became the new standard. Neighbors who had once avoided each other out of fear of being reported now worked together to maintain their community, not out of obligation, but because they genuinely wanted to. Barbara's influence faded into the past, become nothing more than a cautionary tale of what happens when power is abused. As Malik stood on his porch one evening, watching kids ride their bikes and families walk their dogs, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Brentwood Estates was finally becoming the community it was meant to be, and it had all started with one fight against injustice. Malik hadn't planned to change the neighborhood, but sometimes the best leaders are the ones who never sought to lead.